In a desolate desert where despair suffocated any glimmer of hope, a lone cowboy faced a shocking injustice, a crying baby, abandoned to certain death. But the most horrifying thing wasn't this, but the fact that behind it stood the ruthless bandit Hank Morgan, whose revenge cornered the father, forcing him to make an unthinkable sacrifice. However, fate had a special move in store, in the person of Jack Dalton, who was supposed to pass by, but whose gaze at the little girl changed everything, giving the father a second chance at redemption. Find out what a miracle this story of pain and betrayal turned into an ode to the triumph of spirit and justice. Subscribe and like, because the denouement of this story is truly shocking and will give you a priceless lesson in wisdom that will make you look at life in a new way. The superheated air shimmered above the prairie, distorting the horizon in a hazy mirage. Midsummer 1880 Arizona was particularly merciless, and even the saguaro cacti seemed to droop under the weight of the unbearable heat. Jack Dalton, a tall, sinewy cowboy with eyes the color of faded denim, was making his way through the sparse thorny brush. His face, parched by the winds and sun, was covered in a network of deep wrinkles, and a silvery gray was already showing at his temples. He was about 45. But the years spent under the merciless sun of the Wild West had left their mark on him, a man who had seen too much and said too little. He wasn't a hero from dime novels, just a working man, a cattle driver who believed in simple things, keeping his word, strong coffee in the morning, and that good would always find its way, albeit with difficulty. His only luxury was an old but well-maintained Winchester rifle, which he always kept at the ready. Jack had been on the road for 3 days, heading to the town of Fairview to collect an advance for his last job. He had driven a herd from Texas across these endless expanses, and now that the work was almost done, he only dreamed of a cool mug of beer and a hot bath. His only companion was a horse named Red, whose red flanks glistened with sweat. Red was a loyal friend, strong and resilient, who had seen as many roads as Jack. The road was long, and the only sound that broke the silence was the creak of the old leather saddle, occasionally interrupted by the buzzing of annoying flies and the crunch of the drier thunder hooves. Suddenly, a faint but persistent squeak reached his ears. Jack pulled on the reins, making Red stop. He listened, his gaze sweeping the sun-scorched plain. He knew that in this wilderness, sound could be deceptive. It could be the cry of a coyote, the moan of the wind, or even a ghost of the desert playing with the imagination of tired travelers. He frowned, his hand instinctively resting on the revolver's handle. He wanted to ride on, not getting involved in other people's problems, because other people's problems in the Wild West often meant mortal danger. But the sound repeated, this time louder, with a clear hint of a human plea. It was a cry that could not belong to any animal. It was too thin, too heart-rending, too human. Dismounting, Jack tied Red to a low, thorny greasewood bush and moved toward the sound, pushing through the tall, drought-yellowed grass that clung to his pants like 1,000 small, hungry fingers. His heart tightened unpleasantly in his chest when he realized that his gut feeling hadn't failed him. He walked a few more steps, and the smell of dust mixed with a faint but unsettling smell of misfortune. In a small hollow, at the foot of a dried-up tree whose branches looked like bony hands reaching for the sky, lay a bundle of tattered canvas. Flies swirled around it, and the hot air was thick and still. He came closer, and the crying became distinct, piercing, a small cry full of despair. Carefully unwrapping the cloth, he froze in a shock that hit him harder than any bullet. Inside, wrapped in dirty, torn rags, lay a tiny baby girl. She was no older than a year, with a face wrinkled from hunger and dehydration, and thin, almost transparent blonde hair stuck to her damp forehead. Her small hands were clenched into fists, and her blue eyes, full of tears, looked directly at him, pleading, as if she understood the hopelessness of her situation. At that moment, his rough heart, accustomed to the harsh realities of the desert, felt a deep compassion mixed with fury. How could anyone abandon such a helpless creature? The dirty rags she was wrapped in did not protect her from the scorching sun. Jack knelt, his tall, worn boots sinking into the dust. The first thing he did was not pick her up, but cover her fragile face with his wide, tanned hand from the direct, deadly rays. He felt the heat radiating from her tiny body and knew there was no time. To leave her here meant signing her death warrant. His mind, accustomed to the brutal logic of survival in the wilderness, quickly calculated the options. The nearest settlement was 2 days away, and he only had enough water for one more leg of the journey. He wasn't a father, he had no family, and he never thought anyone but his horse would be it in his life. He was a lone wolf, used to relying only on himself. But at that moment, looking into those children's eyes, all his arguments crumbled to dust. All his calculations, his selfishness, his desire to avoid other people's problems, all of it disappeared, melted away under the gaze of those innocent eyes. In the corner of the bundle, he noticed something that sharply contrasted with this lifeless desert. It was a small, carefully carved wooden pendant in the shape of a star, and on the back, a single letter was engraved. The wood was dark, almost black with age, but the carving remained clear and precise. This discovery only deepened his anxiety, adding to the pain for the child the sense of sorrow from the realization of what tragedy had occurred here. Someone's child, someone's hope, someone's part of a soul had been abandoned to certain death. This was not just an accident, it was a story that began here, in the dust. Jack took off his worn leather coat, imbued with the smell of dust and campfire, smelling of smoke and strong tobacco, and carefully wrapped the tiny, almost weightless body in it. The baby fell silent, her crying turning into a weak sob, and she pressed against the warm, rough fabric, seeking protection in it, as if finding support in this vast, merciless world. Gently picking her up, Jack felt the world around him shift. He was no longer just a cattle driver. Now he was the guardian of a fragile life, and this burden was heavier than any load he had ever carried. Returning to Ree, he carefully placed the child in the saddle, securing her so she wouldn't fall out. He took off his cowboy tie, tied it around her small body, attaching it to the saddle belt. The knot was rough but reliable. From now on, their path lay not to Fairview, but in the opposite direction to the nearest rigger, even though it meant they would have to travel much longer and more dangerously, deviating from their usual route by several days into unexplored, more perilous areas. The new goal caused a surge of determination in him. He had to get her to water. He had to save her. From somewhere deep inside, he drew strength he didn't even know he had. Every step of red, every breath of air, every beat of his heart now had only one goal: to survive for this little life. His former, measured life was shattered the moment he heard that cry. It was left behind, in the dust, just like his old plans. Ahead lay the unknown, full of dangers and difficulties, but in this new, difficult path, a sprout of rebirth was already breaking through, a new purpose that made him stronger than ever. The journey to the river turned out to be harder than Jack could have imagined. The heat, like a living monster, drained the strength from him, and red with every passing minute. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning every breath into a scorching ordeal, and their water supplies dwindled before their eyes, leaving only hope for salvation. The little girl, whom he had wrapped in his coat, would wake up from hunger and cry. Her weak crying tore Jack's heart to pieces, making him feel absolutely helpless. He tried to give her water from his flask, moistened with his last bit of whiskey to kill bacteria, but her tiny body rejected the liquid, causing a surge of sadness and despair in him. The baby's eyes became duller, and her breathing intermittent. Jack knew the child needed more than just water, but where, in this lifeless desert, could he find milk or food for an infant? He cursed himself for his inexperience, for not being ready for such a responsibility. Every minute seemed like an eternity, filled with fear and silent pleading. Finally, at the end of the third day after the fateful discovery, when the sun was already setting, painting the sky in fiery orange and purple tones, they reached the river. Its muddy, slowly flowing waters were a salvation for them, a bluish ribbon that promised life. Jack watered Red, who eagerly drank from the water, then quenched his own thirst, feeling the life-giving moisture restore his strength. After that, he moistened a clean piece of fabric torn from his shirt and carefully gave the girl a drink. She eagerly drank from the damp cloth. Her small lips, cracked from the heat, finally felt the saving moisture, and her crying, to Jack's immense relief, finally subsided. This was the first time in many hours that Jack felt even a little relief. He carefully bathed the baby, washing away layers of dust and dirt, and beneath them appeared her soft, pale skin. On her tiny wrist, he noticed a thin, barely visible scar, like the mark of an old burn, an unusual detail that did not fit her infant age. Now that the most acute danger was over, and the baby was peacefully dozing, wrapped in his coat, Jack could examine the pendant more closely. It was not just an ornament, it was a kind of amulet, carved with special care, as if a soul had been put into it. The wood it was made of was dark, almost black, with a glossy surface, polished by years of wearing. On the back, under the familiar letter E, were 3 thin lines converging at a single point, and 2 circles on the sides, forming a complex but harmonious pattern. Jack had never seen anything like it, but it reminded him of old Indian signs he had heard about in stories, symbols of a clan or tribe. A chilling thought suddenly struck him. What if the baby was not an orphan, but a victim? What if she was left here deliberately to die, and the pendant was a mark? The thought pierced him, causing a fit of rage that made him clench his teeth. He clenched his fists so hard that his knuckles turned white. Only a person with not a drop of kindness in their heart, a person devoid of all morality, could do such a thing. Jack felt a rising anger, burning him from within. He decided that he had to find her family, or at least find out who left her here and why. His new goal was justice, and it was stronger than his former desire to run away from all problems. He had to get to the nearest settlement where they might know something about the sign on the pendant, and then find the one who did it. He was no longer just saving a life, he was seeking the truth, and this quest gave him new strength. In the morning, when the first rays of the sun barely touched the horizon, painting the sky in soft pink and golden hues, Jack moved along the river, hoping to meet someone or at least find a trail that could lead him to the solution. He held the baby in his arms, carefully shielding her from the morning chill. By evening, when the sun began to set again, casting long shadows on the scorched earth, they came to an old abandoned farm, surrounded by a dilapidated fence through which dry grass had broken through. It was obvious that no one had lived there for a long time. The roof had caved in, the windows were broken, and the doors hung on a single hinge. But Jack decided to spend the night in the old barn, which, although it looked decrepit, could shelter the child from the night cold and possible predators. He made a small fire in the center of the barn to warm up and cook some kind of dinner. Placing the baby on his coat, which was now her only bed, Jack leaned against the barn wall, watching her. The girl was quietly dozing, her chest rising and falling evenly, and Jack realized with surprise that over these days he had already gotten used to her presence, to this small, fragile being who had completely changed his life. He felt the sense of responsibility for her, as if she were a part of himself. Suddenly, in the silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire, there was a distinct crunch of a branch outside. Jack instantly grabbed his revolver, his eyes narrowed, and all his senses sharpened. Whoever it was, he couldn't let them harm the child. The desert was full of dangers, and he was ready to face any of them. From the darkness of the barn, from behind a pile of old sacks, a man's silhouette appeared. He was dressed in dirty, torn clothes. His hair was matted, and his face, covered in a week's growth of stubble, seemed vaguely familiar to Jack. It was Bob Harper, a former bandit whom Jack had once met in a saloon several years earlier. Harper looked confused and scared, his eyes darting wildly around the barn. He stopped in the doorway, like a ghost, not daring to enter fully. He lowered his eyes, avoiding Jack's direct gaze, and with a trembling hand, pointed to the girl, saying in a hoarse, broken voice, "You found her. I saw it. You saved her. My child." The confession sounded like a gunshot in the silence, tearing away the veil of confusion. Jack's anger instantly turned to shock. This tramp, this pathetic man who could barely stand her father, the one who abandoned her to die in the desert. Jack's world was turned upside down. He expected to find a villain, ruthless and calculating, but found a broken man who now stood before him, unable to control his trembling, his body shaking with uncontrolled tremors. Jack couldn't believe that such a man could be a father capable of such a terrible act, that his words and the unbearable horror in his eyes seemed true, too sincere to be a lie. Jack looked at Harper, then at the girl, and his anger mixed with absolute bewilderment, trying to make sense of this unimaginable situation. Bob Harper's confession rang out like a gunshot, shattering the silence of the dusty bar. Jack lowered his revolver, his arm dropping to his side, but his eyes remained fixed on Bob, unable to believe what he had heard. Standing before him was not a monster who had coldly left a child to die, but a man, broken and exhausted, whose eyes held something more than fear, a deep, unbearable despair that had eaten him from the inside. He looked like an old, worn-out doll from which all the stuffing had been removed. "Wide?" was all Jack could manage, his voice hoarse from shock and a rising wave of confusion within him. "Why did you leave her, Bob?" Bob lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. He was short, thin, with a face furrowed with the marks of sleepless nights and perpetual fear. He was wearing torn, dirty clothes that had possibly once belonged to someone else. "They wanted to take her, Jack," Bob whispered, his voice barely audible, like the rustle of dry leaves. He raised a pleading, anguished gaze to Jack. "I saw them butcher a family at Springs Ranch. To burned house, charred bodies, not a single survivor. We were their last target. I ran, Jack ran like a hunted animal, with her in my arms. I heard their voices, their horses behind me, felt their breath. I couldn't carry her any further. She was so small, so fragile. I thought it was the only chance they wouldn't find us both. I thought they would look for an adult's tracks. I thought I was saving her by leaving her there. I hoped someone would find her, that a miracle would happen. The full brutality of the situation crashed down on Jack with a new, crushing force. This was not a story of cold-blooded cruelty and inhumanity, but of pain, sacrifice, and the horrifying choice a person can make when cornered. Bob thought he was abandoning his child to save her, but in the end, he condemned her to a hungry death in that merciless desert. Jack realized that Harper was not a villain, but a victim of circumstances that were stronger than him, breaking his will and mind. His initial anger was replaced by a deep, agonizing compassion. He looked up at Bob, his eyes searching for something, anything, that could justify this act. Bob looked like a man broken by life, not hardened by it, like many in the Wild West. He was the embodiment of despair. "Who are they?" Jack asked, his voice hardening, a steely edge to it. "The Scorpions gang," Bob whispered, his body shaking again at the mere mention of the name. "Their leader, Hank Morgan. He knows me. We used to work together at the ranch. He's looking for me to get revenge for an old betrayal. I took money from him that he stole from our boss, Mr. Finch, and I ran. He knows I won't stop until I get it to the sheriff. He doesn't just want it back, Jack. He wants me dead. And he won't stop until he finds me. He's not the forgiving type." Bob hugged himself as if trying to shield himself from invisible blows. Jack listened to the story, and anger rose in him again, but this time it was directed not at Bob, but at those Scorpions, at Hank Morgan. He understood that now he and the child were also in danger. Their presence here was no accident, but a continuation of someone else's deadly war, in which he was now involved. But he couldn't back down. Now this matter had become his own, his duty. Bob, despite his past, was trying to do the right thing, and Jack couldn't leave him and his daughter to their fate. Bob knelt before Jack and the girl, who was quietly stirring in his coat. His face was wet with tears that fell silently, leaving dirty streaks on his cheeks. She looks so much like my wife, Elara," Bob sobbed, his voice cracking. "That's her name, Elara. I don't know what to do next. I'm no good for anything." He turned away, hiding his face in his dirty hands, and Jack saw a single, bitter tear roll down his cheek, falling into the dust. It was the tear of a man who had lost everything and no longer believed in himself. Jack looked at the girl, who, peacefully dozing, was snuggled against his coat, her small hand wrapped around his finger. She was destined to die in that grass, under the scorching sun, but she had survived. And now she was in danger from those who were pursuing her father. It was at that moment that Jack felt he was now responsible not only for her life, but also for her future, for the chance to give her a normal life. It was an unbearable burden, but he was ready to carry it. He made a final decision. From now on, he was not just a savior, but a protector. He could no longer run from other people's problems. He had to face the danger head-on, to deal with this gang once and for all, with Hank Morgan, who was behind it all. Jack, Bob, and little Elara, they were now one family, bound not by blood, but by tragedy and a common purpose. Jack didn't want this, but now he had no choice. He had to fight. The next few days were a test not only for Jack, but also for Bob. Jack took on the role not just as a guardian for little Elara, but also as a strategist and mentor for her father. Bob, exhausted and broken, still could not fully recover from the shock and fear. His body was weak, and his spirit crushed, but the mere presence of Elara awakened the smoldering embers of hope in him. His only use was his knowledge of the area and the habits of the Scorpions gang, which he had once known from the inside. They moved along abandoned trails, winding between rocky gorges and weathered cliffs, avoiding major roads and settlements where they could be seen or tracked. Jack taught Bob how to track, how to hide in the shadows of the rocks, how to read the signs of nature, and how to behave in danger. He showed him how to move silently through the dry grass, how to distinguish sounds in the night silence, and how to use the terrain for camouflage. Bob, to his surprise, turned out to be a capable student. His survival instinct, buried deep under layers of fear, was stronger than panic, and now it was awakening for his daughter. They spent their nights hiding in cool caves, deep gorges, or under overhang rocks, where the wind whistled like a hungry coyote. During the day, Jack continued to move without slowing down until the sun began to set, turning the sky into a fiery canvas. Every evening, as the small campfire cast dancing shadows on the walls of their shelter, Jack would tell Alara stories. He talked about how he used to drive cattle for thousands of miles, about wild bulls and fierce storms, about cowboy adventures, and how once he stumbled upon a whole field of juicy oranges that no one had picked, and how the taste of those fruits was sweeter than any whiskey. Bob, listening to his stories, smiled for the first time in a long time. His face, which had been a frozen mask of pain, softened. Jack saw something alive reawakening in Bob's eyes, how he began to show genuine fatherly care, rocking his daughter in his arms and quietly humming her old, forgotten lullabies, the melodies of which seemed to have come from another, peaceful life. Before Jack's eyes, hope became something tangible, something that gave them the strength to move forward, despite all the difficulties. Bob found solace in Alara and Jack in watching them both. One night, as they were hiding in a cramped crevice barely able to shelter the three of them, Bob, pressed against the cold rock, pointed to a distant hill, barely visible in the pale moonlight. His voice was almost inaudible, a whisper that the wind could have carried away. Over there, their camp. The Scorpions gang. They always set up camp there when they're waiting for new people or regrouping after a successful raid, he whispered, and fear flared up in his eyes again. They don't stay there for more than 1 or 2 nights. Jack nodded. He knew he had to act, and act immediately. Time was running out. Leaving Bob and Alara in the crevice was too risky, as they could be discovered, but taking them with him into the bandits' lair even more so. It would be suicide. He made a difficult decision, on which the lives of 2 people who had become truly close to him depended. Bob, I'll go alone, Jack said, his voice as firm as a rock. You must hide Alara here, deep in the crevice, and wait. As soon as I give the signal, you'll escape to the west, to the pass, and it will be safer there. Got it? Not before. He handed Bob his old but reliable revolver, the only one he had. Bob looked at him with fear and anxiety, his lips trembling. But you might not come back, Jack. There are a lot of them. You're alone. Jack put his hand on his shoulder, squeezing it firmly to convey at least some of his confidence. His eyes, usually cold and detached, now burned with an inner fire. I'll be back, Bob. We have a daughter to raise, and she needs you now more than ever. These words sounded not like a promise, but like a vow. At that moment, Bob finally saw in Jack not just a random savior, but a true protector, a man he could rely on, who was ready to do anything for those he had taken under his care. Jack set off, leaving behind 2 people whose lives now depended on him. He moved fast and silently, his figure blending with the shadows cast by the rocks. It was the most dangerous mission of his life, but there was no fear, only cold determination and the anger that burned in his chest. He was going not only for Alara, but for Bob, for the justice that had to prevail. When Jack reached the Scorpions' camp, barely discernible in the pre-dawn twilight, he smelled the heavy, oppressive stench of stale smoke, sweat, and cheap whiskey that hung in the air. It was the smell of danger. He moved soundlessly, his boots barely touching the stony ground, hiding behind rock outcroppings and low-lying bushes. Jack watched. He saw something that made his heart pound harder, with heavy, dull beats that echoed in his ears. Hank Morgan, the gang leader, was sitting by a dying campfire, his broad back turned to Jack. Next to him, like scavengers, sat his men 5 thugs, with dirty faces and hard, unkind eyes, laughing and sipping whiskey from their flasks. Their loud voices and hoarse laughter carried across the night desert, disturbing its peace. Jack felt a surge of burning anger mixed with cold determination. He was alone against 6, but there was no turning back. He had one chance to act quickly, decisively, and as quietly as possible. He quietly, like a shadow, crept into the camp. The first was the sentry, sitting a little way off, lazily smoking a cigarette. Jack crept up from behind, his hand covering the sentry's mouth, and the other, quick and strong, struck the back of his head. The body went limp without a sound. He carefully lowered it into the shadow of a large boulder. Then it was the turn of the 2 other bandits, who, drunk with whiskey, were dozing by the fire, their weapons lying nearby, forgotten and useless. Jack, using a tactic of surprise attack, pounced on Hank, who was sitting with his back to him, engrossed in a story from one of his henchmen. He lunged at him like a wild beast, grabbing him firmly by the throat, holding a knife to his neck. Hank was surprised, but he was a seasoned bandit whose reflexes had been sharpened by years on the run. He reacted instantly, trying to twist away, but Jack's grip was iron. A fierce struggle ensued. The two remaining bandits jumped up, their alcohol fogged eyes slowly coming to. Jack knew he couldn't defeat all of them alone in an open fight, but he didn't need to. His goal was not to eliminate each of them, but to sow chaos and neutralize the leader. He fought to distract them, to use their confusion. In the chaos, when his opponents were disoriented by the unexpectedness of the attack and their sleepiness, he saw the most important thing. He grabbed Hank's arm, forcing him to stand, using the gang leader as a human shield. Jack saw a primal, genuine terror in the bandit's eyes that made him stop. It wasn't anger, not a desire for revenge, but pure, primordial fear. It was at this moment that Jack understood. This man doesn't want revenge. He's just afraid. He's afraid of his past, his sins, and that it's haunting him. And now he was afraid of Jack. This wasn't just a bandit, but a man cornered by his own destiny. It wasn't just a confrontation, but a triumph of spirit over circumstances, a victory of reason over brute force. Jack had the upper hand, not by killing his opponent, but by destroying him morally, stripping him of control and confidence. He tightly bound Hank and his men, using their own ropes, leaving them no chance of escape. He knew that the sheriff he would send from Fairview would soon arrive and finish their story. Justice, finally, would prevail. He left them a little water and warned them that if they tried to escape, a much worse fate awaited them. When he returned, he found Bob, who was sitting, holding Alara close, his face pale with anticipation, but now a smile blossomed on it. Their faces were bright with stares of relief, joy, and gratitude. Finally, they were safe. At that moment, Jack realized that his former life, filled with loneliness and driving cattle, was over. He had found a new purpose in the protection and care of those who had become dear to him. It was a rebirth. He felt not just like a cowboy, but a father, a protector, part of a new family. The sun was rising above the horizon, painting the sky in soft pink and orange tones, and this sunrise was not just a new day, but the beginning of a new life for the three of them. The morning brought not only the first, timid rays of the sun, but also the heavy realization of what had happened. The bound bandits, lying near the extinguished campfire, were a living reminder of the night's battle. Jack checked them one more time, making sure all the ropes were secure. He left them a flask of water, as he had promised, and a bag of hard biscuits that were left from his supplies, before looking away. Revenge was not his style, but justice had its demands. Bob, tightly holding the sleeping Alara in his arms, no longer looked as broken as he had before. There was still a weariness in his eyes, but now it was mixed with steely determination and deep gratitude. They sat in relative silence, broken only by the gentle snoring of the baby and the distant cry of a desert bird. Jack understood that staying at the abandoned farm was dangerous. Other gang members could visit, or just random travelers who could cause trouble. "We can't stay here," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. His gaze swept the horizon. "We need to get to Fairview. There I'll find the sheriff. He'll take care of these scumbags and help you with Alara." Bob nodded, his gaze becoming serious. "I'll go with you, Jack. I won't leave her again. And I have to give that money back to Mr. Finch. It's my duty." He stood up, carefully holding Alara close. His words, spoken with an unexpected firmness, surprised Jack. In this broken man, it seemed, an inner core was being reborn, which he had long considered lost. The journey to Fairview, although shorter than the one to the river, was full of its own trials. The heat did not subside, but now their worries were added to it. Alara needed real food, not just water and crumbs. Jack and Bob took turns carrying the girl, wrapped in the coat, protecting her from the scorching sun and dust. Bob, who was initially clumsy, gradually got used to this burden. His movements became more confident, and the tenderness with which he held his daughter was genuine. They avoided open spaces, keeping closer to the foothills where they could find shelter and, if possible, some shade. One day, as they were making their way through a narrow gorge, they heard a low rumble. Jack instantly grabbed Red by the reins and, gesturing for Bob to hide with Alara behind a large boulder, pulled out his Winchester. The rumble intensified, approaching, and soon a small group of riders appeared from around the bend. 5 men, heavily armed and dressed in dusty clothes, with faces hidden by their hats. They were not the Scorpions, but their appearance did not bode well. Whether they were bandits or just scalp hunters, a collision with them in a narrow passage was extremely undesirable. Jack froze, ready for a fight, his finger on the trigger. The riders stopped just 100 yards away, their horses prancing impatiently. One of them, with a long mustache, looked around, his gaze sweeping over the place where Jack and Bob were hiding. It seemed as if he was about to notice them. The seconds stretched on endlessly. Suddenly, as if by intuition, little Bob, holding a Laura, coughed loudly. The sound echoed through the gorge, attracting the rider's attention. Jack flinched for a moment, but then immediately realized it was done on purpose. Bob drew attention to himself so that Jack could act. "Hey! Who's there?" the mustachioed rider shouted, pulling out his revolver. Jack, without a second thought, fired into the air. The loud sound of the shot shattered the silence, and the bandits' horses neighed in fright, some starting to buck. It was enough to sow panic among them. The bandits, deciding they had fallen into an ambush, began to turn around, their leader cursing as he gave the order to retreat. They quickly disappeared from view, leaving only a cloud of dust behind them. Bob carefully emerged from behind the boulder. His face was pale, but his eyes glowed with satisfaction. "I thought you wouldn't want to shoot them," he muttered, looking at Jack. "But this way they thought there were a lot of us here." He had saved them, using his fear as a weapon, turning weakness into an unexpected cleverness. Jack nodded, acknowledging his quick thinking. Bob wasn't just helping, he was actively participating, making decisions. Continuing on their way, Jack noticed that Alara, despite all the difficulties, was getting stronger. Her crying was less frequent, and sometimes a hint of curiosity appeared in her eyes when she looked at the world around her. She was no longer just a survivor, she was part of their small, unusual family. Bob talked to her, telling her about how good it would be in Fairview, how there would be plenty of food and good people there. He no longer felt worthless. His daughter gave him strength and purpose. On the fourth day of their grueling journey, when the sun was high in the zenith, the outlines of Fairview appeared on the horizon. The houses, the saloon, the church, all of it was a saving oasis after the endless desert. The faint scent of wood and fresh-baked goods hung in the air, which seemed like the sweetest aroma in the world. At the city gates, Jack and Bob stopped. Jack turned to Bob, his face stern. "Bob, first we go to the sheriff. You'll tell him everything, without holding anything back." "I'll be right there." Bob nodded, took a deep breath as if gathering his strength, and looked at Alara. "All right, Jack. I'm ready." There was not a trace of his former insecurity in his voice. He was ready to face his past to secure a future for his daughter. They entered Fairview, and every step was a step toward a new life, toward rebirth. The town of Fairview greeted them neither warmly nor hostilely. Dusty streets, wooden buildings with sun-faded signs, and a few passers-by who looked with curiosity, but without much engagement, at the strange trio: a gloomy cowboy, an exhausted man with a baby in his arms, and a red horse that wearily lowered its head. Jack knew that in such places, strangers were not welcomed with open arms, but he had no intention of lingering. His path led straight to the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office was located in a small but sturdy building on the main street. It signed Sheriff James McKenna was slightly crooked. The door creaked open, letting them into a cool, dimly lit room that smelled of dust, old paper, and tobacco. At a desk piled with papers and empty cartridges sat a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and piercing eyes. This was Sheriff James McKenna, a man who had seen much and was hard to surprise. He looked up, his gaze quickly assessing Jack, then Bob with Alara. "How can I help you, gentlemen?" His voice was deep and even, without a hint of emotion. Jack nodded curtly. "Sheriff, we have a matter, and it concerns the Scorpions gang and Hank Morgan." The mention of those names made McKenna put down his papers. He looked carefully at Bob. "Bob Harper, is that really you? Haven't heard from you in a long time. They said you, well, disappeared." Bob, holding Alara tightly, began his story. He spoke quietly but clearly, hiding nothing, about the theft of money from Mr. Finch, about Hank Morgan's revenge, about the atrocities of the Scorpions at Springs Ranch, and about how he had to abandon his daughter in the desert. He spoke of his despair, of the fear that haunted him, and of how Jack found Alara and saved them both. His voice held pain and remorse, but also a newfound determination. Sheriff McKenna listened carefully, without interrupting. His face remained impassive, but his eyes flashed with anger and then compassion. When Bob finished, Jack added his testimony, describing the bandits' camp and how he had disarmed them. He gave McKenna Lara's pendant, explaining that it was the only clue. "I tied them up in a gorge, about 30 miles east of here, beyond the river. That's where you'll find them." The sheriff nodded, his gaze becoming serious. "Hank Morgan, I knew he'd resurface sooner or later. Those scorpions have been giving us trouble for a long time. And thinks money that's serious. We'll take care of it." He went to a map hanging on the wall and marked a place Jack had pointed to. "It's a good thing you came in, Harper. And you, Dalton, you acted like a real man. The little girl, she's lucky." McKenna looked at Alara, who was sleeping in Bob's arms, and something warm appeared in his eyes. "Well, I'll get a posse together. It'll take some time. In the meantime, you can stay in town. Find a place where Alara can rest." Walking out of the sheriff's office, Jack and Bob felt a huge weight lift from their shoulders. The story was told, justice had begun its course. Now they had to take care of Alara. They headed to a small hotel that looked clean and cozy. They booked a room, and the first thing Bob did was put Alara in the soft bed. She was hungry, and Jack, without a moment's hesitation, bought some warm milk and soft bread from the hotel owner. Alara ate eagerly, and her cheeks finally regained their pink color. Bob sat beside her, watching her every move, and tenderness shone in his eyes. While Alara slept, Bob went with Jack to the saloon, where Jack paid for their dinner and a drink. Bob told him about his wife, Alara, who had died of a fever a year earlier, leaving him alone with the baby. About how he tried to survive, working on Finch's ranch, how Hank Morgan, his former comrade, tried to frame him, and then stole the money intended to pay the workers. Bob, driven not only by a thirst for justice but also by despair, took that money to return it to Mr. Finch, but was forced to run when Hank found out about it. There were no excuses in his voice, only pain and the realization of his mistakes. "I lost everything, Jack," Bob said quietly, looking into his mug. "I thought I lost her too, but you gave her back to me." Jack nodded. He saw how Bob had changed. From a broken man ready to give up, he was turning into a father ready to fight. He reached out and patted Bob on the shoulder. "You're not alone, Bob, and we won't leave you." At that moment, an invisible bond was formed between them, stronger than any blood ties. They were now one team. The next morning, Jack and Bob woke up with a feeling they hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling of calm. Alara was sleeping in bed, her small chest rising and falling evenly. The hotel owner, a good-natured elderly woman, brought them fresh buns and hot coffee, having learned their story from the sheriff. Fairview, although a harsh town, was not indifferent to another's misfortune when the truth came out. Sheriff McKenna, as he had promised, gathered a posse and at dawn headed to the gorge where Jack had tied up the bandits. By noon, word came that the Scorpions, including Hank Morgan, had been captured and brought to the Fairview jail. Justice, slow but inevitable, had finally caught up with them. The money stolen from Mr. Finch was found on Hank and was now waiting to be returned to its rightful owner. Bob, hearing the news, took a deep breath. It was as if a lifetime's worth of weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Jack, his eyes full of gratitude. "Jack, I don't know how to thank you. You saved me. You saved Alara. You gave me my life back." Jack just nodded. "We did it together, Bob. And now you need to start all over again. For Alara." The next day, Bob Harper went to Mr. Finch's ranch. Jack decided to go with him. Finch, an elderly, gray-haired rancher, greeted Bob, whom he considered dead or escaped with the money, with surprise and disbelief. Bob told him the whole story, without embellishment, about his despair, about Hank, and about how Jack had helped him. He returned the money that had been stolen and asked Finch for forgiveness for his flight. Mr. Finch, moved by his sincerity and the story of little Alara, forgave Bob and offered him to return to the ranch, but on different terms, not as a simple worker, but as a manager, a man he could trust. Bob agreed, his eyes glowing with a new hope. He knew this was his chance to atone and build a decent future for his daughter. Alara, thanks to Jack, had a father and a home. Jack, having fulfilled his duty, could not stay. He was a cowboy, a man of the road, and new paths awaited him. Before leaving, he went up to Alara, who was playing with a wooden horse given to her by the hotel owner. He knelt down, and she reached out her small hands to him. "Be a good girl, Alara," he said quietly, stroking her hair. She smiled at him, and in her eyes, as blue as the Arizona sky, Jack saw the future bright and full of hope. He said goodbye to Bob, exchanging a firm handshake. "Be careful, Jack," Bob said, "and thanks for everything." Jack got on red and, with a final look back at Fairview, moved on. He was alone again, But now his loneliness was different. It was filled with memories of a little girl whose crying had changed his life, and of a man who found the strength to be reborn. His journey continued, but now he knew that there was more to his life than just driving cattle and endless miles. He had found meaning in helping another, in protecting the innocent, and that made him stronger. Conclusion and lesson. In the modern world, many people feel lost and disappointed, living for money, thinking that it will bring them happiness. Just as in the story, the money stolen by Hank and then by Bob became the cause of the whole family's misfortune. They faced difficulties because of which the father had to sacrifice what was most precious to him, his daughter. This shows how the pursuit of easy money or attempts to correct a mistake in the wrong way can lead to even greater pain and destruction. The story of Jack Dalton is a reminder that the true value of life is not in material possessions, but in the deeds we do for others. We find true meaning when we stop living only for ourselves and start caring for those who need our help. It is in this selflessness that rebirth lies, the finding of a new purpose that makes us truly alive. Just as Jack found his path by saving a little life, so too can we find ours by extending a helping hand to our neighbor. This story teaches us that even after the most terrible mistakes and losses, there is always a chance for atonement and a new beginning if we are willing to fight for those we hold dear and for justice.